The second time I watched my stepmother sign my father's name on a document he never read, I was standing in the doorway of St. Agnes Hospital's family lounge with a paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold in my hand, and I did not say a word. I'm 33 years old, the kind of 33 where people still ask if you're in your 20s, and I run the credit risk desk at Vance Capital, the firm my father built with a single floor of leased office space and a loan from a man named Harold Pierce. I have a habit of clicking my pen 3 times before I sign anything. A tick my father used to find unbearable, and tonight that habit is the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. It matters later. Almost everything in that lounge matters later, though I didn't know it yet. If you're new here, welcome back to Elena's Rebirth Life, where betrayal never gets the final word. My father, Richard Vance, had been in cardiac intensive care for 6 days. The first time around, I didn't know it was a first time around, not yet, not while I was living it. Vivian had a notary waiting in the hallway before the second day was even over. She called it a precaution. She called everything a precaution. The amended trust document sat in a manila folder with the Harrow and Pierce letterhead. And I remember the smell of the folder, dust, and old glue because I'd carried it myself from the law office on a Tuesday without reading what was inside because Vivian asked me to because she said my father wanted it done before he was too tired to care because I trusted her the way you trust someone who has poured your coffee every morning for 11 years. I am not telling you this because I want sympathy. I'm telling you because you need to understand what kind of fool I was so you understand what it costs to stop being one. That first time, my father died on a Thursday at 4:51 in the morning, and 3 weeks later, I sat in a glass conference room at Harrow and Pierce while a lawyer named Daniel Pierce, Harold's son, read a trust that gave 81% of Vance Capital to my stepmother Vivian and my stepbrother Sterling and gave me a single line that said I would receive my mother's wedding ring and nothing else, as Eleanor has chosen a different path and does not require further provision. I had never chosen any path. I had asked twice to see the final draft. Vivian told me my father was resting and didn't want to be bothered with paperwork while he was trying to get well. I believed her because believing her was easier than believing what was happening in front of me. There were warnings before the will reading, small ones I'd folded into the category of things that didn't matter, the way you fold a receipt into your pocket and forget it's there until it's worn soft at the creases. 6 weeks before my father's first heart attack, the one that should have been a warning shot, not a death sentence, Vivian had asked me to drive her to a storage unit off Route 9 to drop off, she said, some old furniture from the guest room. I sat in the car while she went in alone for 20 minutes, and when she came back out, her hands were empty and she smelled faintly of fresh cardboard, the dry, papery smell of a box that's just been taped shut, and she didn't mention furniture again. I didn't ask. That was the kind of daughter I was in my first life, the kind who let a smell pass through a car without ever wondering what it meant. There was also a dinner 4 months before the funeral at the house on Birchwood Lane, where my father had too much wine and said, apropos of nothing, that he wanted to update his will before things got complicated. And Vivian had laughed, a real laugh, warm, the kind that made you feel foolish for thinking anything was wrong, and said, Richard, you're being morbid, eat your dinner. And he had, because that was the kind of marriage they had, the kind where she could redirect him with a single sentence and he'd follow it gladly, grateful even, to be steered away from something heavy. I remember the smell of that dinner specifically, rosemary and the particular char of lamb my father liked nearly burnt, and I remember not pushing the conversation forward, not asking what he meant by complicated, because some part of me, the part that had spent 33 years being the daughter who didn't make things harder, had already decided it wasn't my place to ask. I lost the apartment on Tyndale Street 14 months later. I lost the job 4 months after that because Sterling sat on the board now and didn't like the way I'd looked at him during a compliance meeting. And being looked at wrong by a Vance was apparently a fireable offense when you were no longer a Vance who mattered. I spent the next 8 years doing other people's bookkeeping for $31 an hour in a 1-bedroom above a laundromat on the wrong end of Crest Hill Avenue. where the radiator banged at 2 in the morning and the smell of fabric softener came up through the floorboards so constantly that I stopped being able to smell anything else. I died in that apartment. Pneumonia, the kind that takes its time, the kind that lets you lie there for 3 days deciding whether it's worth the cab fare to the emergency room. I was 41. The eviction notice was still taped to my refrigerator when the building super found me because I hadn't had the energy to take it down, only the energy to be angry at it every time I opened the door for a glass of water. I remember the exact temperature of the room. I remember a water stain on the ceiling shaped like a fist. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity dying people apparently get, that I had spent my whole life being patient with people who counted on me staying patient. And then I was 33 again, standing in the family lounge at St. Agnes Hospital, coffee going cold in a paper cup, watching Vivian Vance sign a notary form on a folding table with a pen that had Harrow and Pierce printed down the side in gold letters. I knew the date because there was a wall calendar behind the nurse's station with a photograph of a lighthouse on it, and the day was circled in red for some reason I never learned, and it was a Tuesday, 11 days before my father would die on a Thursday at 4:51 in the morning, the same Thursday, the same minute, like the universe had simply rewound the tape and was daring me to press a different button. The first person I saw clearly, the first face that proved to me this wasn't a dream, was a nurse named Carol Nisop. I knew her name because of the plastic badge clipped crooked on her scrub top, and she said, "Are you the daughter? You can go in for 10 minutes. He's stable but tired." And her voice had the exact same flatness it had the first time, the same chapped patch on her bottom lip, and something in my chest folded in on itself like a piece of paper creased too many times. I did not run into the room and tell my father everything. I did not scream at Vivian. I stood very still for a moment, testing the air, testing whether my body still remembered how to be the kind of person who panicked, and found that it didn't. Not anymore. 8 years above a laundromat does something to the part of you that used to flinch. I tested it the way you test a stair you weren't sure would hold your weight. Small things first. I asked Carol, the nurse, casually, what day it was, and she told me, and it matched the date I remembered standing at this exact spot the first time, down to the lighthouse calendar circled in red behind her station. I asked if my father's room number was still 412, and it was. I reached into my coat pocket out of habit and found, instead of the phone I expected, an older model with a cracked corner I hadn't carried in 8 years, the screen lighting up to a date that should have been impossible, and I stood there in the hallway with the fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead, feeling the linoleum cold and slightly tacky under the soles of my shoes, and let myself have exactly 1 full minute of believing I had lost my mind before deciding it didn't matter either way. If I was insane, the only sane thing to do was act like I wasn't, Vivian asked me, without looking up from the form, to walk the folder over to Harrow and Pierce the next morning. Since you're so good at running errands, sweetheart. And the last time I had said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. This time I said, of course, let me just get a coffee first. My hands are freezing, and I clicked my pen 3 times, and I asked the notary, a heavy-set man named Glenn Dussault, who I had never once looked at directly in my first life, what exactly the document said. He blinked at me like nobody had ever asked him that in the lobby of a cardiac ICU. It's an amendment to a revocable trust, he said, authorizing temporary signing power for Mrs. Vance during your father's incapacity. Temporary, he said. I remembered the final trust. I remembered the word permanent buried on page 4, the same page 4 where in my second life I would eventually find a notarized quitclaim deed with blue ink would surface 8 months later with a forged date on it. Can I get a copy? So I asked him for my records. And I smiled the way Vivian always smiled when she wanted something, sweet and a little helpless, and Glenn Dussault, God bless him, photocopied it on the hospital business center machine for 40 cents a page while Vivian was in the bathroom reapplying lipstick the color of a bruise. That copy is still in a safety deposit box at First Continental Bank. It became setup number 1. I didn't know yet what it would pay off into. I only knew, standing in that fluorescent hallway with my heart doing something complicated, that I would never again carry a folder I hadn't read. My father died on schedule. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell you I saved him and I didn't, and some nights I still sit with that. The cardiologist, a tired man named Dr. Okafor, with a habit of pressing his glasses up with one knuckle, told me the second heart attack was always going to happen, that the first one had done more damage than they'd let on, that there was nothing, not love, not memory, not 11 years of foreknowledge that could have stopped a torn vessel from tearing again. I held my father's hand the last night. It smelled like the hospital soap, harsh and a little like bleach, with something sweetish underneath that I later learned was the lotion Vivian rubbed into his knuckles every evening, performing devotion for an audience that had already stopped watching. He said one thing to me that last night, the same thing he'd said the first time, except this time I heard it differently because I already knew what was coming. He said, "Don't let Sterling run the desk. He doesn't read the footnotes." And then he slept, and I sat there for 3 hours doing math in my head, because if there was one thing growing up in that house had taught me, it was that my father's offhand sentences were never offhand. He didn't read the footnotes. Neither, as it turned out, had Vivian. Not really, not the parts that mattered, because the trust she'd had drawn up after his death, the one that gave her 81% and sterling control of the operating company, Oseki, had been built on the bones of the very document I now had a time-stamped copy of, a temporary authorization she had quietly let calcify into something permanent, with a Second Amendment slipped in 9 days after the funeral, an amendment that, in my first life, I had never thought to ask Daniel Pierce to date stamp against the original. This time I asked. This time I didn't sign anything in the 3 weeks after the funeral. I went to the will reading 11 days after I'd watched Vivian and the notary in the hallway, 11 days, not 3 weeks, because in my second life I had stopped letting things drag, and I brought a recorder the size of a tube of lip balm, the kind you could buy at the Radio Hut on Wexler Street for $19, and I clipped it inside my coat pocket and said nothing about it to anyone, and I let Vivian's lawyer, the same Daniel Pierce, read the same line about Eleanor choosing a different path. I did not argue in that room. That was the hardest part, harder than anything physical I'd ever done, sitting in a leather chair with my hands folded while a stranger read my own disinheritance out loud in a voice as flat as a weather report and not saying a single word in my own defense. My jaw ached for 2 days afterward from how hard I'd been clenching it without noticing. But I had learned the slow and expensive way that arguing in that room only told them what I knew. Silence told them nothing. Silence was the only thing I had that they couldn't take. I want to tell you about Sterling, because he wasn't a monster, not the way you'd want him to be if you were watching this unfold from a safe distance. Sterling Vance was 36 and had a habit of cracking his knuckles before difficult conversations, and underneath all of it, underneath the watch he wore that cost more than my old apartment's yearly rent, he was afraid of being seen as the son who only got there because his mother married well, afraid of the desk my father had told me not to let him run, afraid in a way that came out as a kind of hunger he never seemed to fill, no matter how much of the company landed in his hands. He had a line he liked to say, my father's son, repeating it without irony, "Numbers don't lie, people do." He said it at every meeting, every dinner, every time he wanted to sound like the man my father had been. In my first life, he said it the week he fired me, standing in the doorway of the compliance office with his sleeves rolled up like he'd done something requiring physical effort. In my second life, he would say it again in a much bigger room, and it would be the last sentence anyone in that room ever respected him for saying. Vivian was harder to explain because grief and greed had braided together in her so tightly that I'm not sure she could have told you which one was driving on any given day. She had married my father 9 years after my mother died, and she had genuinely, I believe, loved him in the particular way some people love a house, for what it gave them, for the shape it let them live inside. She kept a photograph of herself and my father on a boat off Bell Harbor on her nightstand, and she touched the frame every morning, and she also, the week he died, called Harrow and Pierce 4 times before the funeral home had even finished arrangements. Both things were true. People rarely come apart cleanly enough to hate without complication. The 5 months after the will reading were the quietest months of my life, and also the loudest, because I had stopped performing calm for other people and started actually being it, which is a different muscle entirely. I went back to my desk at Vance Capital. Sterling didn't fire me right away this time. In my first life, it had taken 4 months. This time it took longer because I had become someone harder to find a clean reason to fire. I stopped looking at him wrong. I stopped looking at anyone wrong. I came in at 7:40 every morning. I left at 6:15 every evening. I brought him coffee from the cart on the ground floor exactly the way he liked it, 2 sugars, no cream, and I let him believe the way men like Sterling always wanted to believe, that I had simply accepted my place. What he didn't know was that I had spent every lunch hour for 5 months at a small public records office 2 blocks from First Continental Bank, pulling filings, deed transfers, the original incorporation papers for the holding company that owned 40% of Vance Capital's real estate assets. Papers that had my mother's maiden name buried in them from a structure she and my father had set up in the early years before Vivian, before any of it. A structure nobody had bothered to fully dissolve because nobody but me had ever cared enough to read footnotes either. There was a smell to that records office, dust, and the particular mildew of paper that's been stored in a basement too long. And I came to like it the way you come to like the smell of a place where something true is happening to you, even if the something is slow and unglamorous and mostly involves a copier that jammed every 11th page. The second escalation step came on a Wednesday in October, 11 weeks after the funeral, when I overheard Vivian on the phone in my father's old study, a room she had already started calling hers, instructing someone to move $42,000 from the company's discretionary account into what she called the Bell Harbor Fund, her voice dropping into that particular register people use when they think the walls aren't listening. I stood in the hallway with my hand on the cold brass doorknob, not breathing, my heart going in that old familiar way, and I thought of my father's hand in mine smelling of hospital soap, and I did not open the door. Instead, I went to the bank the following morning, First Continental, the same bank that held my safety deposit box, and I asked a teller named Renata. I remember her name because she had a small gold cross at her throat that caught the light when she leaned over the counter, for a printed statement history on the discretionary account, which I still had limited access to from my position at the firm. I requested it in person on paper instead of pulling it digitally because paper with a teller's initials on it cannot be quietly deleted from a server 6 months later. Renata took longer than I expected, frowning at her screen, tapping one fingernail against the counter, and when she finally handed the pages across, she said, without quite meeting my eyes, "You're Richard Vance's daughter, aren't you? He used to bring you in here when you were small. You'd sit on that bench by the window and eat the lollipops we kept by the register." I hadn't remembered the bench or the lollipops until she said it, and something in my chest went tight and unexpected, the kind of grief that arrives sideways instead of head on. That statement became setup number 2. There was a third moment, smaller, that I almost let pass me by, the kind of detail my father always said separated the people who survived this business from the people who didn't. Sterling had a habit, the same one from my first life, the one I'd nearly forgotten until I watched him do it again in a meeting about the Hargrove acquisition, of initialing documents in green ink instead of black, because his father-in-law from his first brief marriage had once told him green ink looked more executive, and Sterling had never let go of it. In my first life, I thought it was just a quirk. In my second life, sitting 2 seats down from him at the conference table, watching him initial a side letter to the Hargrove deal in green ink without reading the indemnification clause on page 6, I understood it was a tell. He signed fast when he felt important. He signed fast and didn't read when someone flattered him first. I started flattering him. God help me, I did. I told him his instincts on the Hargrove numbers were sharper than our father's had been at that age, which was a lie so transparent I was amazed it worked. And it worked because Sterling had spent his whole life wanting someone to say exactly that sentence to him, and within 3 weeks he had stopped double-checking anything I put in front of him because I had become, in his mind, the sister who finally understood his value. There was also Constance Whitford, who I'd noticed early on sat at the far end of every board table and said almost nothing, taking notes in a small leather notebook with a pen that never seemed to run out of ink. In late November, I stayed behind after a quarterly meeting under the pretense of returning a borrowed folder and found her still in the room, gathering her things slowly, in no hurry. Your father used to say the quiet ones on a board are either useless or dangerous, she said, not looking up, and it's worth finding out which before you need to know. I didn't answer her directly. I only asked whether she remembered the terms of the original trust, the one drawn up while my father was healthy enough to argue about every clause himself. She said she did in detail because she'd been one of the 3 witnesses present when it was signed, and that detail, the fact of her presence, her memory, her willingness to be asked, became something I carried with me all winter, not as evidence exactly, but as the quiet certainty that I would not be standing alone in that room in April. What I put in front of him slowly across the winter were documents that required his signature on the very structures my mother's name was buried inside. Refinancing approvals, transfer authorizations, small administrative pieces of a much larger machine. Each one initialed in green ink, fast, unread, exactly the way he'd signed away 40% of his own leverage without ever knowing it. There was a night in December I have to tell you about, because it's the one that still sits in my chest sometimes, heavier than the rest. I went back to Crest Hill Avenue, not to live. I had an apartment near the office by then. Small but mine, the radiator working properly for the first time in either of my lives. But I went back to stand outside the building with the laundromat on the ground floor, the one where I died at 41 in a room with a water stain shaped like a fist. It was snowing, the thin kind that doesn't stick, and I could smell the dryer exhaust venting out onto the sidewalk, warm and sweet and chemical, the smell I used to hate so much I'd stopped registering it as a smell at all. The window of what had been my apartment was lit, someone else's curtains hanging there now, a pale yellow I never would have chosen, and for a moment I let myself imagine the stranger living inside it, whether they slept well, whether the radiator still banged at 2 in the morning the way it always had for me. I stood there for 11 minutes. I checked my phone, 11 minutes exactly, and I let myself feel afraid just once, just for that length of time, the old fear of becoming that woman again, of the eviction notice on the refrigerator, of nobody finding me for 3 days. I pressed my gloved hand flat against the brick of the building, cold even through the wool, and I thought about how strange it was that a building could hold no memory of you at all while you stood there holding every memory of it. Then I put my hands in my coat pockets and walked back to the train, and I let the fear stay where it belonged behind me, doing nothing. The 4th escalation came from a place I hadn't expected. Daniel Pierce, the lawyer's son, the one who had read my disinheritance out loud in a flat voice twice now across 2 different lifetimes. I found him at the Oak Room on a Thursday in February, the restaurant on Holloway Street where my father used to take me for my birthday every year before Vivian, where the bartender still remembered somehow that I liked my old-fashioned with an extra cherry. Daniel was there alone, 3 drinks in, his tie loosened, and there was a particular slump to his shoulders I recognized because I'd worn it myself for 8 years. Your father's firm let mine handle everything because he trusted the name Pierce, Daniel said, not quite looking at me, the ice in his glass clicking when he turned it. My father's not well, you know. Hasn't been for a year. I've been the one actually drafting half of what comes out of that office since last spring, and nobody checks my work because nobody wants to insult an old man's son. I asked him, very gently, who had asked for the Second Amendment to be drafted 9 days after my father's funeral. He didn't answer right away. He looked at his glass for a long moment, and then he said, I shouldn't be telling you this, which is what people say right before they tell you the thing that breaks everything open. And then he told me Vivian had asked for it, and she'd asked for it to be backdated to look like it had been prepared while my father was still alive, and Daniel, 28 years old and terrified of disappointing a father who was dying slower than mine had done it because she'd told him it was what Richard Vance would have wanted anyway, just a formality to spare me a complicated grieving process. I didn't react the way I wanted to. I kept my hands flat on the bar and I ordered him another drink, and I said very quietly that I understood that fathers put impossible weight on their sons sometimes, and Daniel Pierce, drunk, guilty, lonely in the particular way men get when they've spent a year being competent in public and ashamed in private. Told me where the original undoctored drafts were still stored because his father's office, old-fashioned to the bone, kept paper backups of everything in a fireproof cabinet nobody had thought to clean out. That became setup number 3, and it cost me nothing but 2 old fashions and the willingness to sit still while a stranger confessed. I never forgot the storage unit off Route 9, even though in my first life I'd let the memory of it go soft and useless in my pocket. In my second life, in January, I drove out there alone on a Saturday, the kind of flat, gray afternoon where the cold gets into your knuckles before you've even left the car, and I found the facility still standing, the same chain link fence, the same faded blue door numbers. The unit was no longer rented under Vivian's name. She'd let the lease lapse 2 years after my father's death, the manager told me, flipping through a binder with visible reluctance until I mentioned gently that I was settling an estate matter and needed to know who'd cleared it out and when. He remembered because not many people clear out a storage unit themselves at 6 in the morning the way the file said Vivian had, 11 days after my father's funeral. The same 11 days again, that number kept circling back like a current under all of it. Carrying out 4 boxes she'd labeled in black marker RV personal, and dropping off the keys without a forwarding address, I didn't find anything inside that unit. It was empty, swept, smelling of nothing but concrete dust and motor oil from whatever truck had used the space before. But the manager's logbook entry, a date, a time, and initials that became its own small thing, a thread that, woven together with the Second Amendment's backdating, proved a pattern I could lay in front of people later. A woman who had begun preparing for her husband's death before there was any reasonable cause to expect it. The months between January and April moved slower than any 8 years of my first life ever had, which surprised me, because I'd assumed urgency would feel like speed, and instead it felt like its opposite. Long stretches of ordinary days where nothing seemed to be happening at all, where I went to the records office and the bank and sat through meetings where Sterling cracked his knuckles before saying something he thought sounded like our father. And the only thing marking the passage of time was the slow, careful weight of the folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, growing heavier by a single page every week or two. There was a Tuesday in February I almost didn't survive without breaking my own rule. Sterling came into my office unannounced, sat on the edge of my desk the way he used to when we were teenagers and our father wasn't home, and said almost gently, almost like the brother I used to want him to be, "You've been different this year. Better. I'm glad you stayed." And for one terrible second, I wanted to tell him everything. Wanted to warn him the way you want to warn someone walking toward a door you know is locked from the other side. Because some small, stupid 11-year-old part of me still wanted Sterling to be the brother who deserved warning. I didn't say anything. I told him his numbers on the Hargrove deal looked sharp, and he smiled like I'd handed him something, and 3 days later he initialed another transfer in green ink without reading past the first paragraph. By March, 8 months into my second life, I had the photocopy from the hospital hallway, the bank statement with Renata's initials, 4 documents bearing Sterling's careless green ink, a verbal confession from Daniel Pierce that I had this time recorded on the same $19 device from Radio Hut, and the original undoctored trust draft retrieved from a fireproof cabinet at Harrow and Pierce on a Saturday morning when Daniel, full of the specific bravery that comes after confession, let me in himself. There was one evening that week, the night before the shareholders' dinner was formally announced, when Sterling came by the house on Birchwood Lane unannounced, the way he used to as a boy let himself in through the kitchen door without knocking. He found me at the table going through what he assumed were quarterly reports, and he sat down across from me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything, and I noticed he'd brought a bottle of the same wine our father used to drink with the burnt lamb, as if some part of him remembered that dinner too, even if he'd never known what it cost me. "I miss him," Sterling said, turning his glass slowly by the stem, not looking at me. "I know everyone thinks I just wanted the company. I did want it, but I miss him too." I believed him. That was the worst part, sitting there with the folder closed under my hand, believing he meant it and knowing it changed nothing about what was coming. I told him I missed him too, which was also true, and we drank the wine and neither of us mentioned the green ink. I still hadn't said a word to anyone about any of it. There were nights I lay awake and felt the old fear try to climb back into my chest, the fear that said none of this would matter, that paper never beats people who control the room, that I would end up back above the laundromat no matter what I collected. I let the fear sit there. I didn't argue with it. I just kept getting up at 7:40 and going to work and bringing Sterling his coffee with 2 sugars and no cream. The 5th and final escalation arrived on its own, the way the worst ones always do. Vivian and Sterling, confident now, 11 months in, decided to formalize everything at a company board meeting in April. The annual shareholders' dinner held in the Whitfield Room on the top floor of the Vance Capitol building, the same room my father used to hold his year-end address in, the same room where, in my first life, I had not even been invited. This time, I was invited because Sterling, flush with the confidence of a man who believed his sister finally respected him, had pushed for it himself. "She should be there," he told Vivian over a phone call I happened to overhear because I was standing close enough to the study door to hear it and far enough to seem like I wasn't trying to. "She's been solid all year. Let her sit at the table." Vivian agreed, the way you agreed to let a thing you no longer fear sit closer to the fire. The dinner was set for the second Friday in April, 61 people on the guest list, including 3 members of the original board my father had personally appointed, a reporter from a regional finance publication who covered private equity transitions, and Harold Pierce himself, wheeled in by a homemade, frailer than I'd remembered, his eyes sharper than his body. I wore my mother's wedding ring on a chain under my blouse that night, the only thing Vivian's first trust had ever allowed me to keep. I want you to understand I wasn't performing some grand symbolic gesture by wearing it. I just wanted something of hers against my skin while I did what I was about to do. The room smelled like candle wax and the particular sweetness of catered shrimp. And there was a string quartet in the corner playing something forgettable, and Vivian stood at the head of the table in a navy dress with her hand resting on the back of what used to be my father's chair, looking, for the first time in either of my lives, completely at peace. Sterling gave a toast. He said the line. Of course he said the line. Numbers don't lie, people do. Lifting his glass to a room full of people who had known my father for 30 years, and I watched 3 of the old board members exchange a look I recognized, because it was the look people give each other when a son is trying too hard to sound like the father he buried. I waited until the dessert plates had been cleared. I had practiced this moment for 11 months without ever rehearsing a single word out loud, because I had learned, finally, that the people who win in rooms like that aren't the ones who arrive with a speech. They're the ones who arrive with proof and let the room do the talking for them. I stood up. I said one sentence, and I said it quietly, the way you'd mentioned you'd forgotten to turn off the stove. Before we move to the year-end summary, I think Daniel has something he wants to clarify about the trust amendment from last August. The room didn't go silent the way it does in movies. It went uneven, orc style, a fork set down too hard a chair creaking, Harold Pierce's home aide leaning forward, and Daniel Pierce, who I had spoken to 2 days earlier, who had spent 11 months carrying the specific weight of having falsified a date for a dying man's estate, stood up from his seat near the window and, in a voice that shook only slightly, said that the amendment granting Vivian Vance permanent signing authority had in fact been drafted and backdated 9 days after Richard Vance's death, not before it, at Vivian's direct request. I watched Vivian's face. I had spent 8 years imagining what that face would do in a moment like this, and the truth was duller and more human than anything I'd imagined. She didn't gasp, she didn't deny it loudly. She went very still, the way people go still when they realize the floor they've been standing on for a year was never load-bearing. Her hand, the one resting on the back of my father's old chair, tightened on the wood until her knuckles went pale, and I noticed, in that strange, hyper-attentive way, you notice things at the worst possible moments, that she was wearing the same perfume she'd worn the night I carried that first folder to Harrow and Pierce. Something floral and slightly too sweet, the kind of scent that clings to a room long after the person has left it. "Daniel," she said, and her voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it, "you don't have to do this. Whatever Eleanor has told you..." She didn't tell me anything, Daniel said, and his hands were shaking visibly now, the glass of water in front of him trembling enough that the ice clicked against the side. I told her, because somebody was going to find it eventually, and I'd rather it be found because I said it than because I got caught. I placed the photocopy from the hospital hallway on the table, the one Glenn Dussault had run off for 40 cents a page, dated and time-stamped, showing the original document had been labeled, in plain language, temporary. I placed the bank statement next to it, Renata's initials visible in the corner, showing the $42,000 moved into the Bell Harbor Fund 11 weeks after the funeral, under an authority that the first document proved had never legally existed past my father's death. And I placed last the 4 pages bearing Sterling's green ink, the administrative transfers he'd signed without reading, each one quietly reattaching 40% of the real estate holding company to the structure that bore my mother's maiden name. A structure that, under the original undoctored trust now sitting on the table in front of Harold Pierce's trembling hands, had never legally left her line of inheritance at all. Sterling stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor, a sound that cut through the string quartet's last note, and he said, "Numbers don't lie." Again, the same line, except this time his voice cracked in the middle of it, because he had finally understood in front of 61 witnesses that the numbers in front of him were his own signature 4 times over on documents he'd never bothered to read. Harold Pierce, frail as he was, looked at his son for a long moment and then said, in a voice that carried, despite its thinness, "You backdated a man's trust 9 days after I buried my oldest client." And that was the sentence that finally broke the room loose. One of the old board members, a woman named Constance Whitford, who had sat silent through everything, the same silent presence she'd always been in every meeting I could remember, finally spoke 4 words, the only thing she said all night. I want it investigated. Nobody needed me to scream. I hadn't raised my voice once. I sat back down, folded my hands the way I had 11 months earlier at the will reading, and let the room turn the way rooms turn when the people who control them have run out of plausible denial. The consequences didn't arrive all at once, which is its own kind of justice, slower and more thorough than a single dramatic collapse. Within 6 weeks, the board, the real board, the one my father had appointed, the one that had simply gone quiet for a year out of grief and deference, voted to remove Sterling from any signing authority pending the outcome of a state inquiry into the estate's administration. He lost his office on the 14th floor first, then his parking space, small things that mattered more to him, I think, than the larger ones, because status had always been the air he breathed. Vivian's lawyer, not Daniel, a defense attorney from a different firm entirely, since Harrow and Pierce had quietly declined to continue representing her, told her In a meeting I wasn't in the room for but heard about from Constance Whitford over coffee that the cleanest path forward was a negotiated settlement, returning the Bell Harbor Fund and the real estate stake in exchange for the state inquiry being narrowed rather than expanded. She signed it. I wasn't there to watch her sign it, and I didn't ask to be, because by then I no longer needed to see her hand shake to know that it did. There was a smaller consequence that nobody at the table that night would have predicted, the kind my father always said mattered more than the loud ones. Constance Whitford, the board member who had said 4 words and nothing else all evening, called me herself 2 weeks later, her voice crisp over the phone, and told me she'd known something was wrong for over a year and had said nothing because she'd assumed wrongly that it wasn't her place to interfere in a family's grief. I should have asked more questions when you stopped coming to the holiday dinners, she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like an apology, though she never used the word. I told her it wasn't her fault. I'm not sure either of us fully believed it, but it felt important to say anyway, the way some sentences matter less for their truth than for the fact that someone was finally willing to say them out loud. Daniel Pierce kept his license barely after a formal reprimand and 2 years of supervised practice, and the last time I saw him, he thanked me, for giving him the chance to say it himself before someone else found it and made it worse. I don't know what to do with that gratitude even now. I think some people need to be caught gently before they can stop falling. Sterling moved out of the house on Birchwood Lane in June. I happened to be there the day he left, not by accident. I'd come to collect the last of my mother's things from the attic, a box of photographs Vivian had never bothered to throw out, and I watched him carry 2 suitcases down the front steps while a moving truck idled at the curb, and I thought of the line in my father's voice, the one from the hospital room. Don't let Sterling run the desk. He hadn't run anything in the end. He'd signed what was put in front of him because someone had finally learned to flatter him the way he'd always wanted to be flattered, and that, more than any document, was the thing that undid him. Vivian stayed in the house another 4 months. Smaller in it than she'd ever looked before, and then she sold it. To me, as it happened, though she didn't know that until the closing because I bought it through the same holding structure that bore my mother's maiden name, the one nobody but me had thought to keep alive. I didn't do it for cruelty. I did it because it was the only house I had ever lived in where I remembered my mother's hands, and I wanted it back with my own name on the deed, in ink, signed slowly, with my pen clicked 3 times first out of habit rather than fear. I changed the locks the week I moved back in, not because I thought anyone would try to come through the door. Vivian had moved to a condominium near Bell Harbor, and Sterling had taken a job, the last I heard, doing compliance work at a much smaller firm 2 states away. The kind of job where nobody asks what color ink you sign with. But because changing the locks was a sentence I wanted to finish with my own hands. The locksmith was an older man named Petrov who worked slowly, methodically, humming something under his breath while he drilled out the old cylinder. And when he finally handed me the new keys still warm from his hand, I stood in the front hallway afterward, holding the old key in my palm, feeling how light it was, how strange that something so small had organized 8 years of my first life and 11 months of my second. I walked through the rooms that evening with the lights off, just to see what the house felt like in the dark, the way I used to as a girl when I couldn't sleep and wanted to feel the floors creak under my own feet without anyone telling me to go back to bed. The kitchen still smelled faintly of someone else's cooking, garlic, and butter ghosted into the walls, and I opened the window over the sink despite the cold, just to let it air out, just to start replacing one smell with another, slowly, the way you do with everything that's been someone else's for too long. Then I set the old key down on the hall table, next to the bowl where my father used to keep his car keys, and I left it there. I still go to St. Agnes Hospital sometimes, not for any medical reason, just to sit in the family lounge for a few minutes on the anniversary of the week my father was admitted. The vending machine coffee is exactly as bad as I remember. Carol, the nurse, retired 2 years ago. A younger nurse works that shift now, and she has no idea why a woman in an expensive coat sometimes sits in the corner chair for 20 minutes and then leaves without buying anything from the machine after all. I think about the 11 minutes I stood outside the building on Crest Hill Avenue in the snow, letting the old fear visit me on a schedule of my choosing instead of its own. I think sometimes that trust isn't a weakness. It's the thing that makes any of this worth surviving for. But giving it twice to the same hands that already broke it once isn't trust anymore. It's just exhaustion wearing trust's clothes. Some doors really aren't meant to be reopened. They're meant to be locked from the inside by the person who finally has the key. If you've made it this far, I'd like to know, what's the one detail you'd have caught the second time around? The one you missed the first? Tell me in the comments. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you a little after the screen goes dark, stick around. There's always another door someone thought they'd locked for good.